All right, really excited to be here with you all today. I hope you're having a great conference so far. I know a lot of these speakers are putting out some really great content. I wish I wasn't working half the day and just got to listen. But for the next 15 minutes, I want to take you on a little adventure through the hidden secrets of the Angular Forms API. A little bit about me. My name is Jennifer Wadella. You can follow me on Twitter at @OMG@Sveti. I'm the director of Angular development at a consulting company called Bitovi. I'm an Angular GDE. I would definitely consider myself an Angular archaeologist, going and exploring scary Angular code bases and a discoverer of API mysteries, the things that just aren't quite spelled out in the docs. And that leads us to what we're going to be doing on our adventure, which is discovering the hidden secrets of the ReactiveForms API. This is all there in the code base, so it's just learning how to explore the code base and really understand and make sense of everything and what they mean. Because a lot of times when we're developing, this is what happens, is we have a feature to build, and so we're like, okay, how do I get as quickly as I can from point A to point B? And what that means is we're writing code as quick as we can, and we're not necessarily taking time to really explore and understand the technology that we're working with, or some things that might not be available. And so it's kind of like we have one half of a medallion, and we're reading the instructions, and we're only getting part of the information, and that might lead us to the wrong end result. So by equipping ourselves with having a really good understanding of the Forms API, we can make sure that we're getting from point A to point B the best way possible with the most robust knowledge and able to solve some pretty tricky situations. So if we dig into the ReactiveForms module by importing this into our root app module, we discover a lot of treasures that are just there and ready for our taking. One of the things we get are built-in validators. You might not be aware that whenever you're dealing with form validation, you're going to have email validators available to you, validators for checkboxes, a max length and a min length validator, and both patterns and required validators. So those are all built-in treasures ready for us to use. We also have value accessor directives. So these are the directives that are built that are basically bridging that gap between our DOM elements that we're creating, whether it's an input or a checkbox or a select, and linking those to our actual reactive form controls that we're creating. We have status directives. So if you've ever noticed that you get those nice classes that let you know what's going on with your form elements, whether it's an invalid form element, whether it hasn't been touched yet, you notice those classes are getting added on your DOM elements. The NGControl status directive is what's doing that. So we get all these built-in directives that are handling that functionality for us. We get form control directives. We've got our form array name. We've got our form control directive, our form control name. These are all different utility directives that we can use to bind to elements in the DOM and get the kind of behavior that we want without having to write a lot of things from scratch. In form development, we run into a lot of advanced form scenarios that can be really difficult to deal with. And so my goal for this talk is to really explore the API so you have a good understanding of how to tackle any form scenario that you might run across just by using the built-in functionality that you may not have realized was even there. We can do things like changing input requiredness depending on the state of other inputs. We can handle custom validation. We can handle adding and removing inputs dynamically. We can also deal with creating custom reusable form elements. If we are, for instance, having an address block that we want to repeat a lot and use throughout our application, how can we create and abstract that out with our forms without having to do a lot of messy code? We can deal with consuming third-party libraries or web components. I know a lot of people have kind of moved to building in their own design systems, and especially if they're dealing with maintaining a lot of different applications that may not all be written in Angular, web components and building web component libraries is a really robust way to go. But then to take a web component that represents some sort of form element and integrate that with your EO application can be a little tricky, but all completely possible just with the ReactiveForms API. We can also look at creating forms based on a JSON structure. And we can also access a parent form group across components or routes. So for those times that you're building like a multi-step wizard for some sort of form, how do you access everything that you need inside of a form group without getting those pesky errors of, oh, cannot locate this form control? So to tackle some of these scenarios, we need to get our Form Archaeology 101 course under our belt. We really need to understand what's going on. So we've got a couple basics here. First, we have our form control, which is our basic building block for creating an input, a radio, select, whatever. All this does is it creates a form control that's going to have a value and a validation status, among other properties and things like that. But this is kind of our core piece of information that's going to represent a key value pair and maybe the data that we're going to submit to an endpoint. We have form groups, which are groups of form controls. We have form arrays, which is an array of form control. I feel like this hangs a lot of people up when they're not quite sure how to deal with creating dynamic form groups or form controls. So that's available for us. One little hidden treasure that I like to point out when I'm talking about the Forms API is pretty much all of these inherit from this abstract class, or this base abstract class called AbstractControl. So a lot of times what I like to do is I'll just have this page up in the Angular documentation on the website. And so I can go and click through and really quickly see any properties that are available across this, any different methods that I might want to deal with that are available on this AbstractControl. So like I mentioned, with our form controls, we really care about a value and a validity, but there are other things that we might care about too. For instance, whether it's disabled, if it's pending, if it's been touched or interacted with. And we also want to be able to know when our value changes or when our status changes, because a lot of times when we're building dynamic pieces with controls that play together, we need to track those things. So for instance, a form control has a value changes observable that you can subscribe to that will emit anytime that value changes on that form control. Same with status changes. If it changes from valid to invalid or vice versa, there's an observable that we can subscribe to. So all sorts of great methods at your disposal here, just if you're aware of what's going on with them. So the AbstractControl class is your best friend. This is your guide to all things forms, and I would recommend getting quite comfy and familiar with it. It's also important to be aware of the NG control status and NG control status group directives. I mentioned these briefly earlier, but this is the directive that's going to apply classes like NG valid, NG invalid, NG pending, NG pristine to your form control or your form element, depending on what you're using, to display some of these classes, because there are a lot of times that we're going to want to show different user interaction. Instead of having to manually add classes or do all these checks for us, we can rely on Angular's native behavior and really understand how to hook into that to display what we want. And then we have validation. This is another big part of form archaeology on 101. One of the biggest mistakes I see is developers not understanding what's available with them with Angular validation and then going and writing their own system. And it's just a lot of work that you don't have to do and then maintain. So we have basic required validation, which is where we initialize a form control. And we can just call validators.required to say, hey, this is required. It does need to have a validator. There are other validators at our disposal. Like I mentioned, we have an email one. We also have max length and patterns. So be sure to check out what validators are already available to you before setting out to write your own and save yourself some time. We have pattern validation. So if you're having to deal with a pesky regex, maybe you need a date formatted in a specific time for form control. You can use the validator's pattern function for that, where you just pass in your pattern name. The example on the bottom is my preferred method, especially if I'm dealing with regexes, is I like to give it an appropriate variable name so the developer behind me can kind of understand what's going on. It's not like written in ancient Egyptian or anything like that. And then I pass in that variable name to the validator's pattern function, and it's very clear and readable to understand exactly what we're validating against. We also have function validation. So if you ever have a time where you have some sort of control and it needs to be within, like, let's say a range of values, and you need to do some sort of comparison on the fly where you can't just pass in like a static pattern or something like that, you can actually do function validation where you have a bit more control for your comparisons, and they can return errors based on whether it meets whatever functionality is there. So this, again, all built in and available to you with the ReactiveForms API. And so that's a good basic understanding, but if we really want to be great Angular form archaeologists, we definitely need to take our Form Archaeology 102. And these are some even better things that we can understand and be aware of to know how to write better forms. So the first thing is there are a couple different form utilities at our disposal. The first one is our form control name. And this ties a DOM element to the form control by its name. So a lot of times I will see people that they have their base form group object, and they'll call, like, form group.controls to access the controls inside of that. And then the next key, like whether it's a form group or a form group name, they'll pass that in. We can just use form control name, which will accept a string, and then it will look in whatever its parent form directive is to try and find the form control associated with that name. So this can save us a lot of time and energy. We also have form group name, which does the exact same thing, except instead of looking for a form control, it's going to look for a form group. as well as form array name. So if we're dealing with an array and maybe we want to have validation based on that, we can use the form array directive to say, hey, okay, inside of this form group that we're dealing with, find a form array element by this name that we're passing in. And finally, we have form builder, and this is just a shorthand syntax for creating form controls in anything you want. So you can import this, and instead of having to say like new form control every time, you can do this .form builder and then pass it in some options, and it'll understand what's going on there. So when we talk about using like form control name and form group name, this is an example of how it can help you. So in this example, we have an array called flowers, and then in this for loop, we're iterating over these flowers, and for each flower, we want to display a form control that's the type and the color. So you might see something like this, where, okay, we know flowers is a form array, and so we're going to get all the controls out of that and iterate over those. Well, the cool thing we can do here is we can go ahead and use the form group directive and tie that to flower. And so we can use the form control name, and it's going to say, okay, get a form control name of type inside of this form group. And so you don't have to do all this repetitive typing here. So great ways to do more readable code that's all built in for you. One of the other things I want to mention, because I, again, feel like I see a lot of people writing a lot more code than they have to, is we can use these form name directives, because what happens is when you tie that directive to a DOM element, whether it's just like a div, in this case, I've got this form group called villager info. It's going to track the validation status of everything inside of that directive. So inside of this form group, if any of the controls is invalid, that ng-invalid class is going to get applied to that parent level wrapper that you see that I kind of have surrounded in the red dots, and then for everything below there. So understand that you can do a lot of UI manipulation just by binding things appropriately using directives to display the information that you need. And a quick example of form builder, this is kind of what some of that syntax looks like, where we go in ahead and we import our form builder. And then instead of having to type out, new form array, new form group, new form control, you can create a structure very quickly like this. So some pretty sweet utilities that we can use to really make great things happen without having to write a lot of additional code, just by having a really good understanding of the ReactiveForms API and how we can utilize it. And then finally, for the experts in form archaeology, we've got some form super elite hacks. And one of these is the control value accessor, and the other is control container. Control container technically comes from just the forms module, but I like to mention it because you can do some really cool stuff with it. So the control value accessor, if you're not familiar with, creates a bridge from DOM elements to form controls. So if you've ever been in a situation where maybe you're dealing with a third-party library and they don't support reactive forms, and you're trying to figure out how to deal with like combining ng model with a reactive form control, what you can do is create a wrapper component that implements the control value accessor interface. And essentially when your third-party component like makes a change, let's say it's a type ahead and there's a selection event where they've selected the item, then you can use the change value method on your control value accessor interface to emit that value to your form control, instead of having to wire up your own event emitters and everything like that. The control value accessor interface looks like this. It has 3 required methods that you need to implement, and then it has an optional set disabled state method. So the right value method is going to change anytime the form control value changes. So if you're needing to update your component to reflect that, you can hook into this function. We've got our register on change function, which is going to essentially emit our change value. And then we have a register on touched, because we want to know whether a user has interacted with our control a lot of times for just validation purposes and displaying. And then with our set disabled state, this function will be called whenever a form control is enabled or disabled. And so if you need to display anything, that's how that's done. All right, so it's actually cool to know that the control value accessor sounds a little scary, but these directives are actually built in, and this is what Angular is using under the hood. So you can see the selector here, where they're actually looking for this form control name directive. They're using this to actually implement their default value accessor to create these. So it's kind of cool to understand that this is really how things are happening under the hood. And the control container is a base class for directives of registering instances of ng control. So this is a great way to be able to kind of combine different form groups and connect them together without, again, having to use event emitters. So a couple recipes I want to talk about with like my last couple minutes left. I mentioned that one of the difficult things we deal with is input requiredness based on other inputs. And so all these things are built into the ReactiveForms API that we can use with the value changes observable of our form control. We can use a set validators method to change the validation required for a form control as things change. And we can also call update value and validity. And so that's going to retrigger change detection to evaluate the form control and display any relevant classes. We can handle custom validation by getting comparison values. We can create our own validation functions that maybe take the value from a form control and compare to determine whether it's valid or not, and then pass these validators around to our different controls. We can add and remove inputs dynamically as needed. That form array has a couple different methods. It's got a push and insert and a remove at method that'll allow us to remove and add form controls to our array. We can create form control or reusable form elements, like I mentioned with the control value accessor, where we can make sure to wire up our register on change and register on touch methods and have those act as normal form elements in the DOM. We can also use this approach for dealing with third-party web component libraries. And we can also actually create forms dynamically based on JSON just by understanding how our form groups, our form arrays, and our form controls work, and then creating dynamic structures from iterating over those. And then we can use the access form group across components by using the control container. So I've got the slides available online for you here. I know this was a very quick run through, but these are available at Hidden Secrets Form APIs .jenniferwadella.com. And if you have any questions, definitely post them in the Slack channel. I know that was a lot of content coming at you, but I believe I will be available for a Q&A session in a little bit as well. So I hope you have a great rest of your conference and a lovely rest of your day, you wonderful humans.